Welcome to our presentation, Defining Evidence-Based Voice Pedagogy, a New Framework. I'm Kari Ragan, and on behalf of myself and my colleagues, I would like to thank NATS for the invitation to present at the 56th National Conference, which has now become an historic virtual conference due to COVID-19. In May of 2018, I first presented my evidence-based voice pedagogy framework at the symposium, The Art and Science of Great Teaching, celebrating the legacy of William Vennard. At that symposium, my presentation was ironically titled Evidence-Based Voice Pedagogy in Defense of Scientific Understanding. And I say ironic because at the beginning of writing the larger Vennard paper, I really had no idea that it would lead to this smaller paper in which I set out to define evidence-based voice pedagogy. I think that I, like many of my colleagues, associated the term evidence-based voice pedagogy as a science component of teaching singing. But as you'll see today, I hope it really needs to be defined in broader terms. At the Vennard Symposium, the point of the original paper was to state that voice science over the past several decades has given rise to a paradigm shift within the field of voice teaching. In the 21st century, it is time for collective agreement about the need for teachers of singing to understand basic principles of voice production. Knowledge of anatomy, physiology, acoustics, cognition, and familiarity with the functions of voice production as they apply to the musical genres in which their students sing should be at the core of any singing teacher's pedagogy. The presentation was really sort of a call to action for our profession to acknowledge and accept that agreement that anyone who chooses to hang a shingle should have some basic knowledge of those principles. However, I realized that the tone of the larger paper might be off-putting to some in our profession, and that was absolutely not my intent. So, as I continued to explore how to present my ideas, there were several experiences that came together that spring that led to this light bulb moment about the necessity to clearly define evidence-based voice pedagogy. That is represented in my Journal of Singing article from November 2018. Defining evidence-based voice pedagogy, a new framework. Then, in anticipation of presenting EBVP at this NATS conference, I decided to invite my esteemed colleagues, Lynn Maxfield, Ken Bozeman, and Lynn Helding to help expand each of these three important components. It has been a fun and extraordinary adventure to collaborate with these three brilliant colleagues. So I now begin by presenting my framework for evidence-based voice pedagogy and the process of modeling it from evidence-based medicine. In the field of medicine, they have identified a systemization of what is called evidence-based medicine. And an important achievement of EBM has been the development by which critical analysis of research methods occur in order to summarize best available evidence. Guidelines provide what constitutes viable research to use in medical diagnosis. However, it is an approach to medicine that is more than scientific research. EBM evolved over time to a modern framework of systematized standards of care that integrates three important components: best external evidence, individual clinical expertise, and patient values and preferences. The framework of EBM eventually advanced to other behavioral health arenas, including our colleagues in speech and hearing sciences. And those fields call it evidence-based practice, which is a term that connotes somewhat different meanings in different professional disciplines. EBP, in 2005, our collaborators in voice care, ASHA, created the American Speech Language Hearing Association's Coordinating Committee on Evidence-Based Practice and laid out a framework for incorporating EBP into ASHA guidelines. The goal of EBP is the integration of best available research evidence, clinical expertise, expert opinion, and client preferences and values. In my Journal of Singing paper, at the Vennard Symposium, and now at this NATS conference, I present a similar framework for defining evidence-based voice pedagogy, one that I feel is inclusive and invites everyone to the table. The framework for EBVP adapts from the same three essential components of EBM and EBP because it really seemed like a natural segue to developing it. So, relevant scientific evidence becomes voice research. Clinical expertise and experience becomes voice teacher experience and expertise. And patient values and preferences becomes student goals and perspectives. Evidence-based voice pedagogy is defined as the integration of voice teacher expertise, experience, and student goals, perspectives with relevant research into voice science and production to effectively evaluate and identify technical inefficiencies in order to guide students towards vocally healthy and efficient, stylistically accurate, and artistic performances. The first component, voice research, refers to relevant research on voice and singing voice production and the sciences of the voice, sports, cognition and learning, medicine, speech and hearing, acoustics, and psychology. Voice teacher experience and expertise encompasses the knowledge acquired as both a performer and teacher. Expertise consists in the effective use of highly trained skills and understanding in the promotion of vocal technique and healthy musicianship, language, stylistic accuracy and artistry, as well as the ability to efficiently identify and formulate solutions to technical challenges. Expertise necessitates the use of creativity, instinct, observation, and exploration to ensure that solutions are responsive to the individual needs of the student, providing optimal vocal outcomes. Student goals and perspectives acknowledges that optimal pedagogical teaching outcomes require a consideration of the interests, values, needs, and choices of the individuals we teach. It recognizes the value of collaborative and humanistic approach that accounts for factors unique to the individual that may impact their learning process. This requires voice teachers to take a collaborative approach in order to identify the students' goals and perspectives both at the outset of and throughout their learning process. The significance of EBVP framework is that it acknowledges the importance of traditional empirical approach, which deserves our respect, but requires translation and validation through collaboration with relevant voice research as the foundation of a teaching approach. One does not preclude the other, quite the contrary. Voice science research can provide part of the foundation from which to build an approach, but the art of teaching comes from experience. One does not learn to teach voice by reading a book on singing or solely by studying voice science. Acknowledging the importance of scientific research and the rigorous controls it often undergoes, there is still value in anecdotal evidence. Demonstrating efficacy is the most important component to any teaching approach. Successful teaching comes from a variety of informational and experiential sources, some scientific and some as a practitioner of voice teaching, all of which are accounted for in EBVP. So after my colleagues present on how they've expanded each of these three components, we will then have a roundtable discussion about the intersection of the Venn diagram. But now it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Lynn Maxfield.
Okay, thank you, Kari, for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about the first component of the evidence-based voice pedagogy Venn diagram, voice research. So I think the first step in discussing the component of voice research is to try to answer the question, what is research? If you happen to view the session that Brian Maternak and I hosted where we discussed our research in music theater singing, you are likely familiar with this quote from the anthropologist and author Zora Neale Hurston. Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. That purpose becomes really important. Now, if we want to get a little bit more descriptive, however, we can define research as a systematic investigation aimed at creating and developing new knowledge. This systematic investigation can utilize many methodologies like prospective human subject trials and biomechanical modeling, but also including historical analyses, case studies, and practice-based research. As we recognize the breadth of what research can look like, we can also see that there are truly innumerable fields of study in which research can be conducted. For the purpose of evidence-based pedagogy, I think we can divide these fields into broad categories of the sciences and the humanities. So let's talk about science first. We can define science as a body of knowledge about a topic which can be described via a process of observation and experimentation. This process of observation and experimentation has been formalized as the scientific method. Most of you are familiar with this from middle school, high school science classes. But it begins with an observation, step one. And that observation then leads to a question. Let me move my, my name here. A question. After you come up with your question about what you're seeing, then you hypothesize about why you're seeing it. Then you make a prediction about what is causing that. And then you test or experiment with that prediction. And then you start it all over again with a new iteration. You revise your hypothesis, and you revise your prediction, and you retest. And this process goes on and on. Now, if you'll allow me a moment to step onto a soapbox, in today's climate of widespread skepticism of, quote, science, I want to point out that science, as it is defined here, is absolutely dependent on the process. The body of knowledge will change as the process takes its iterative course of revision and re-experimentation. This is a good thing. Too often we're asked, often in rowdy online discussions, whether we believe in science. The implied meaning of this question is, do you believe in the body of knowledge? I think we would be wiser to emphasize that we believe in the process by which the body of knowledge is shaped. The scientific method may not be perfect, but it is the best tool that we have yet developed to accurately describe the world that we live in. So we can further divide those sciences then into the physical sciences, such as the study of the natural phenomenon, non-living, such as physics and chemistry. The biological sciences, study of living organisms and systems, e.g. biology, microbiology, and biochemistry. And the social and behavioral sciences, the studies of human behavior, such as psychology, anthropology, and sociology. If we think about this in terms of how these areas might fit into the voice pedagogy world, physical sciences would encompass the acoustics research that we see. The biological sciences, you might see information from morphology of tissues of the larynx, biomechanics of respiration. Those would fit in the biological sciences. And the social and behavioral sciences would include questions about how do learners acquire new skills and knowledge. All right, now let me pause to remind you that a couple of minutes ago we discussed that there are two broad fields of research, as science and the humanities. This should be clear, but I want to emphasize here that voice research does not equate to voice science alone. Research conducted in the fields of voice science and vocology clearly are part of the voice research component, but any research in the arts and humanities that is relevant to voice pedagogy must also be included in the voice research component. I'll say it again. Voice science does not equal voice research, does not equal voice science, does not equal voice research. They're not the same thing. So let's discuss research in the humanities for a few minutes. The English department at the University of Washington actually has this really nice quote about on their research page. A common misconception about research is reinforced when we view research as solely in terms of the discovery of things previously unknown, such as a new species or an archaeological artifact, rather than as a process, there's that word again, that includes the reinterpretation from a critical or creative perspective to generate innovative art and new analysis. Now, at the University of Utah, which is a Tier 1 research institution, we've been working hard to redefine the cultural understanding of research at that institution to be more inclusive of works in colleges outside of the sciences. Part of why this task is so difficult is simple economics. At research institutions, research equals funding, and funding opportunities are far greater in number and size of awards in the sciences. But we must not allow the evidence-based voice pedagogy to overemphasize scientific research at the expense or dismissal of humanistic research. There is room and need for both. Some of the examples of areas in which humanistic studies and research might take place, there are many of them. These are just a few. Art and art history, world languages, history, linguistics, philosophy, religious studies. Anyone who's been teaching and singing for any amount of time can clearly see that research in these fields, the systematic investigation in these fields, has informed our practice as both teachers and performers. Now, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that most research, regardless of this field, can be broadly classified into by how it is applied, how immediately it is applied. First of all, we have research that we can think of as basic fundamental research. These are research aims that are looking at better understanding fundamental principles and phenomena without an immediate direct application in mind, such as, why does a cell process this way? We don't know what that will lead to, but it's a good question and we want to know. And then there is the applied or translational research, which aims to apply those fundamental understandings that we get from basic research to a practice. Again, there's room and need for both in all areas of research. All right, now how we review and assess the research we encounter is an area that I think we can all improve. I don't really have time in this presentation to go into a lot of detail, but here are 3 things that you can consider when you're weighing the value and applicability of any research results that you might come across. These are termed gold standards by Alan Bailyn in this really great 2010 book, The Critical Assessment of Research. First of all, look for peer review. We can't all be experts in every field, regardless of how many followers you have on social media. That doesn't make you an expert. So peer review allows you to rely on the other experts in that field. So if a study has gone through peer review, ideally that has gone out to 3, 4, 5 other experts who are working in that field to assess the quality of the protocol and the accuracy of the results. So if something has gone through peer review, that is the first step in sort of its believability. Then you can look at the reputation of the journal and the publisher. Look for, this is where you get skeptical of things that you find online that are not widely distributed by a known publisher. There is a growing problem in research of predatory journals who are encouraging researchers to publish there, and they don't have great systems for peer review. They may say that they have peer review, but they don't. And so this is becoming an increasing problem. So look at the reputation of the journal. I think all of us can probably step back and think of 4 or 5 journals in our field that we trust, that have been around for a long time. It's not to say that anything published in other journals may not be applicable to what we're doing, but you start with what you know. Then finally, you can look at the author credentials and the reputation. Is this somebody who has been, whose work has held up over years? Is it somebody who has been working in this area and has a great reputation for clean research and conservative publication of results? Conservative there meaning you're not overreaching with how you say your results are applicable. Other considerations that you might take are the sponsorship and the funding source. As sad as this may be, the funding sources can influence how the results are presented. They may not explicitly influence the research itself, but they can they can lead to emphasizing how they're presented, perhaps overreaching what the data may actually show. And then sometimes it can actually influence the results themselves. So industry funded research is not to be thrown out immediately, but you should consider it. If it is leading you toward results that then profit their company, you should be skeptical and think about it in another way. And finally, you can look at funding mechanisms that may indicate an ideological influence, such as funding coming from think tanks or areas that are clearly leaning in one ideological direction or another. Okay, finally, I want to come back to how research is weighed according to its methodology. And this is from the evidence-based medicine paradigm. There's a clear hierarchy that's been established in this model where results from meta-analysis should ideally be more generalizable, which means they have greater ecological validity than the background information and the expert opinion and non-evidence-based medicine guidelines down at the bottom. Now, Kari and I initially set out to recreate a hierarchy like this to describe the research for evidence-based voice pedagogy, but we quickly found that this model just didn't quite fit for our field. Medicine, while it's often described as an art, has largely quantifiable outcomes, and the outcomes of voice pedagogy are much more subjective in nature. So instead of a hierarchy, we came up with this following model here that draws attention to the great number of fields whose works influence voice research and ultimately voice pedagogy. The small circles surrounding the voice science and arts and humanities areas are certainly not exhaustive, but we've tried to draw out the main fields of investigation, the primary areas of research that are actively influencing how we practice voice pedagogy. I think it's a nice model for how we can look at how inclusive voice research can be and how much we can draw upon as practitioners in voice pedagogy. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kenneth Bozeman, who will discuss the second component, the teacher expertise and experience. Thank you.
Hello, NATS colleagues, and thank you, Kari, for including me in this project. There are three main components to the teacher expertise part of evidence-based pedagogy: personal training, performance experience, and teaching experience. These components are not isolated from voice research. Indeed, they ideally began drawing from all resources early on. However, I will focus my comments on the lived experience part of each. The tone of my observations will be based less on research than on the essentially experiential, intuitive, and observational nature of the way a teacher gains expertise. There is a guiding principle at play. There is no substitute for the essential, inescapable fact that in developing expertise at any applied skill, you learn by doing. We should never minimize the importance or value of that process. Empiricism involves evidence gained by experience, observation, and informed trial and error explorations. This is what we do in the studio. It starts with personal training. The first leg of teacher preparation is our own personal vocal journey. The deliberate, intentional process of developing your own singing lays the very foundation of your future pedagogy. It involves both our mentors and our personal practice history. Challenges faced and mastered are instructive. It is, of course, crucial to have had effective mentors. It is also crucial to have been open-minded and honestly self-evaluative during that process. One's own psychological resilience in the midst of a journey which had no guaranteed outcome will have impacted one's openness to learning during that process. It is typically necessary to have trained one's own singing to relative mastery. This training was not experienced in isolation or in a vacuum. You were not, nor did remain, a blank page. You gradually accumulated information from pedagogic traditions. You began to be exposed to singing concepts through your teacher, through pedagogy courses, and possibly through exposure to some voice science along the way. You began to develop your ear, eye, and somatic sense for functionally efficient singing appropriate to the genres you were studying. In sum, your own singing journey became the foundation of your teacher expertise. The second main component of teacher expertise is personal performance experience. If performance is professional in intent, it has, in addition to the paramount goal of communication, the goal of optimizing performance excellence, of saying what you have to say as effectively and well as you can say it. Preparing and delivering successful performances teaches things that cannot be learned any other way. Sensing audience response, how one is connecting to them or not, pacing oneself through a taxing program, adapting your singing to the hall and personal health circumstance when needed. The effectiveness of performance is more significant to learning than the venue. You also learn evaluative diagnostic skills as well as what excellence is from observing the performances of colleagues, mentors, and of exemplary masters, both live and recorded. Teacher expertise requires us to develop a performance-informed pedagogy. The third component of teacher expertise is the teaching experience itself. While we should prepare as well as we can beforehand, teaching can only really be processed and learned on the ground in the experience of teaching others yourself. That process has inherent value. As mentioned earlier, it is built upon your own learning journey and your gradually assembled understanding from observing the singing, performing, and teaching of others. As you then teach, if you are open-minded and attentive, you steadily develop your diagnostic ear and eye for functionally successful singing, your vicarious empathy for assessing what a student is doing, and the creativity to strategize effective ways to change behaviors. Our studio process is both empiric and heuristic. It is a practical, exploratory, intuitive form of problem solving based on plausible, possible, creative solutions. Like science, it uses disciplined, longitudinal observation, reasoning, past experience, experimental trial and error methods, and a relatively high subject number. Unlike science, it is less rigorously constrained. It is more holistic, creative, intuitive, and psychological. In other words, it is more human and heuristic. Heuristic solutions are not guaranteed to be perfect or final, but they must be sufficient for the immediate goals and efficient with the available time. Ideally, our experience is also fed by colleague interactions and dialogue. This requires an openness to learning from colleagues, from those close at hand, even from those with whom we at first think we disagree. It helps maintain balance in pedagogic emphasis and priorities, and it provides stimulation of new views and approaches. Ironically, many of us are more willing to learn from distant experts than from a colleague in the studio next door. This is unfortunate. If true collegial exchange is not happening informally, it may need a deliberate structural framework. There are surely things we can learn from each other. Finally, taking advantage of continuing education opportunities supports teacher expertise. This may be in the form of pedagogy courses and workshops, or written pedagogic resources, by paying attention to ongoing emerging research, and by continuing your own personal singing development. In sum, teacher expertise gleaned from applied practitioner experience is an essential component of evidence-based voice pedagogy. If rightly understood and vetted for quality, it contributes a valid, compelling kind of evidence to the conversation. Now, our colleague Lynn Helding will address the third element of evidence-based voice pedagogy, student goals and perspectives.
Good afternoon. This is Lynn Helding from the University of Southern California, Professor of Practice in Vocal Arts and Opera and Vocal Pedagogy. I first want to start by thanking Kari Ragan, as I get set up here, for realizing the great potential in this evidence-based framework for vocal pedagogy. So I want to start with Kari's target article and define what student goals and perspectives are. Student goals and perspectives acknowledge that optimal pedagogic teaching outcomes require consideration of the interests, values, needs, and choices of the individuals that we teach. According to Kari Ragan, this requires voice teachers to take a collaborative approach in order to identify those goals and perspectives of the student, both at the outset of the teaching relationship and also throughout the learning experience. And I want to emphasize that collaboration really is the key word when it comes to considering student goals and perspectives. But I'd like to first pause to consider what is learning from the cognitive literature. There are two classic definitions from cognitive science. Declarative learning, or what we might think of as book learning, which is defined as a process that results in a permanent change in behavior as a result of experience. And procedural learning, or what we might call body learning, which is a process that results in a permanent change in behavior as a result of practice. As you might imagine, learning and cognitive science in general are extremely complex and lengthy topics, and we don't have time to go much further than this today, except to acknowledge that there are three basic components that are shared by all learning, whether declarative or procedural. And those components are attention, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Today we're going to be focusing on attention. Attention really is the first and critical step in learning. It is also extremely fragile. And so when we consider this aspect of attention, we might wonder, what are some things that can help attention? What can aid attention? These are the things that we know. Strong emotion, joyful and traumatic, motivation, and desire. Now, strong emotion attends attention often through our own volition, that is our own wanting to, but sometimes, particularly with traumatic emotion, this is not a situation that we would choose. And so this is part of what underlies the disorder of post-traumatic stress disorder. One more very important learning aid is effort. And so if we combine all of these attributes of attention and learning itself, attention, learning, motivation, desire, effort, it ends up in this very nice idea that was codified by psychologist Robert Bjork, who called these desirable difficulties. Bjork defined desirable difficulties as a set of manipulations that create difficulties for the learner but have a good effect on long-term learning. And we might replace the word a set of manipulations with a phrase more like an assignment or a thing to practice for the week. These are the things that we teachers create. So sometimes I say that teachers are in the job of designing desirable difficulties for their students. So how might we use desirable difficulties to create this tool to leverage students' motivation, their agency, which we might define as their self-knowledge in how they can control their learning journey, and their responsibility for their own learning? One tool that we have in our toolkit is goal setting. Goal setting can be defined as the conscious act of listing goals that one wishes to reach. This is not a difficult idea. Benefits of goal setting: spark student desire. Goal setting can sustain student motivation. It can keep students' attention focused. It certainly enhances their agency, and it seems to increase student responsibility for learning. So let's look a little bit more closely at how we might use goal setting and what it is. When we put goal setting in the framework of what we know now about cognitive science, I like to say that goal setting in 2020 is not your parents' goal setting. This is something different entirely. Goal setting has been shown in the short run to stimulate motivation, and in the long run to actually increase achievement. I'd like to pause here for a moment and note there is a vast difference, especially when you look at it through the cognitive lens, between learning and performance. Learning is messy, learning is dynamic, learning makes the learner unstable. These are the exact opposite of what we want to attend performance. Performance, I like to say, is a freeze frame of where the person is at any moment in their learning journey. And most of us would hope that that freeze frame is anything but messy and unstable. So in this definition of goal setting, or this attribute of goal setting, we see that it can help both. It can help both the messy learning process, but also the actual achievement that we want at the end of our studies. Goal setting works this way in part by concretizing or making solid vague notions of achievement. There are also these benefits that we know to goal setting. Goal setting promotes focus, which is part of attention. It cultivates self-regulation and aids impulse control. This can be particularly important when one is trying to adhere to a diet regimen, for example, or an exercise regimen. Goal setting also helps calibrate efficient use of our time and other resources, like money. All of these benefits can then combine to promote positive feelings in the learner because they're accomplishing something, which then in turn feeds more motivation, which usually feeds more achievement. In order for these benefits of goal setting to occur, there are several other important factors that must be considered. Probably the number one thing is that goals must be specific. This is really important, especially when we teachers are working with younger learners. In voice, we might say a specific goal could be, I want to develop a more efficient breathing strategy. This is a very specific goal. But goals like, I want to sing better, are just too vague, first of all, to be able to be realized in any measurable way. And they don't have a strong track record for achievement. A second component we know about the effectiveness of goal setting is to write it down. Don't just let it exist in the learner's mind, or don't just have it spoken between the learner and the teacher. Goals that are written down, and furthermore goals that are posted somewhere and referred to, especially goals that are shared with a teacher, are more likely to be followed than those that simply exist in the mind or exist as a verbal agreement. Who the goal setter is very important. The goal setter must be the student musician, him or herself, and not the student's teacher or parent or colleague or friend. Now, why is this so? Well, because self-motivation is the most effective and successful type of motivation that we know. Mastering one's destiny is an extremely powerful motivator. We also know that goals like or prizes like praise or money or candy as a reward usually do not have a strong effect on learning. Goals also have to be then valued by the person who sets them. This is similar to the idea we just talked about. Why is this? Well, it's simple. Aspirations that are not one's own are usually doomed from the outset. But a more extreme example comes to us from the examples set by wunderkinds in both music and sports. Dreams that are so freighted by the wishes of others, like parents or coaches, for example, can severely compromise the mental health of the learner because this person takes on another person's vision. And as I mentioned, the biographies of wunderkinds in music and sport have sadly attested to this. Goals also have to be both realistic and realizable. We might say to a learner, don't bite off more than you can chew. And to teachers, we have to make sure that we set parameters that are both challenging yet achievable. We might refer to this as the Goldilocks rule. Not too hard, not too soft. This idea is at the core of desirable difficulties. Goals also need to be interesting to keep our attention, so we need variety. We also need variety in terms of their realizability, we might say. We need to create both short-term and long-term goals. Learners will stay more motivated if they can realize a goal quickly, that's the short-term goal, while keeping their eyes on the prize, the long-term goal. And it's up to us teachers not only to set these desirable difficulties, but to construct lessons that can guarantee this early accomplishment and then gradually move our learners outward in these concentric rings of success. Another important component of goal setting is to answer the question, how? This is a very powerful question. So again, in the same way that we don't want students to be vague, I just want to be a better singer, studies have shown that students who are required not only to state the goal, even if it's very specific, but to state exactly how they intend to achieve it, we're more likely to succeed. So one suggestion might be assess how much practice time your student can devote per week. Help them draft a practice schedule and then commit to it. Document this practice schedule by something called journaling. So these are very easy and effective techniques that any teacher can put into place almost immediately. First, require your students to complete a goal-setting assignment. I require this at the outset of my relationship with my students, and I would add that I do this both for students who are registered for course credit and a grade, and also my private clients. Of course, I can't require my private clients to do this, but I urge them to do this as an effective return on their investment. A good tip is to review this contract together, both at the beginning, as I stated, but also periodically throughout your relationship. Require your students to complete a weekly practice journal. I'm going to share my weekly practice journal with you. I'm going to share 2 parts of this 3-part assignment. I actually also require my students to do a written transcription of their previous lesson. Again, I require this for my students who take a grade, but I also strongly suggest it to my private clients. So this is what my weekly practice reflection or voice journal looks like. The goal, the overarching idea, is to reflect back upon your practice week and then write a short summary. The due date is 9 a.m. the day of their lesson, so that this has 2 benefits. It gives the student the entire week to think about how things went, past tense, and it also allows me to upload them in my mind as I'm going into the lesson. The content is, as you might imagine, number of practice sessions per week, where they practice, the length, but the most important part you find here on the right-hand column, which is overall, how was it? How did it go? What repertoire did you work on? What technical aspects did you work on? And what was challenging or easy, and why? And at this point, I do invite my students to add any other important issues or experiences they had or observations from other rehearsals, as long as it feeds into the voice lesson and their voice study. Another component of my weekly voice journal is this. My students are required to tell me what their lesson plan is, and it is written exactly this way in their directions. What is your plan for our lesson today? Emphasis on those pronouns. The ethos is, as active learners, it is your job as a student to tell me what we intend to accomplish together today, not the other way around. This can be challenging for younger learners, but it's also very interesting for them, and it harkens back to a word I used earlier in this presentation, and that is student agency. When you give students agency to construct their own lesson plan, and when they're responsible for it, some very, very interesting and wonderful things begin to happen in the lesson. Some prompts, as you might imagine: what repertoire would you like to work on today? What technical aspects would you like to work on today? And perhaps more importantly, why? I'd like to know why. And then other aspects that I may not be thinking that's on their mind. This is their chance to tell me what they consider to be most important. It's also our chance to discuss that. Maybe I think that their French diction is just fine and we don't need to spend yet a 3rd week on that. So it's an opportunity to have this collaboration that we spoke of at the beginning of this presentation. So summary, benefits of goal setting and journaling, which are really 2 sides of the same coin. The goal setting is a contract, and we add that together with this weekly practice journal. There are many benefits in my estimation. It sparks desire in the student, it sustains their motivation, it keeps their attention focused. As I mentioned, it enhances their agency. This is particularly important for younger students or shy students. This empowerment on their part for many of them is a new idea and a very positive idea, and thus it increases their responsibility for their own learning. Learning is a partnership between 2 actors, the teacher and the learner, And so the grand benefit, at least in my view, of goal setting is that it takes 100% of the responsibility for achievement and for learning, frankly, off of the teacher and shares at least some of this responsibility with the learner. Thank you. And now we are going to have a group discussion on evidence-based vocal pedagogy, led by Kari Ragan and also with Ken Bozeman, Lynn Maxfield, and myself, Lynn Helding. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for helping expand evidence-based voice pedagogy, you guys. I really appreciate your incredible insight into defining this framework further. And I really hope that evidence-based voice pedagogy becomes common nomenclature in our field. Part of what prompted this is that I would see on social media a lot of the language of evidence-based voice pedagogy. And as I said in my component, I really thought that was about the science part. And of course, and really it was probably Ken's social media on Facebook talking about, wait a minute, let's not forget this practice-based component. And so I thank you, Ken, for that helped lead to this. So I want to talk, though, about the hierarchy of the three components, that we don't want to think that voice science or voice research is the top of a pyramid, that all three components need to live next to each other and they need to grow in balance with each other. And I think that I've felt for a while that perhaps our profession overcorrected to swing a pendulum over to the voice research side a little bit. And I think I see a trend perhaps in aspects of our field coming back somewhere in the middle, that again, inviting everybody to the table. So let's just talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on the hierarchy or not having a hierarchy to EBVP.
That's what I wanted to point out quickly, is that I feel fairly strongly that there shouldn't be any hierarchy to it. If it's, the Venn diagram right now is somewhat of a triangle, but perhaps it could exist as a pinwheel where it's constantly just moving around, and we have different ones are at the different top. And I think really our focus of all of this has to be at the center of it. Yeah, in fact, on your diagram, you've got EBVP literally lives right at the center of that Venn diagram. It's labeled as being where all three of those intersect. And so that by its very nature sort of alleviates any hierarchical relationship.
Yeah, and I would add that it really neatly encapsulates a nice idea from expertise study, which is called knowledge over historical time, which is just a fancy way of saying that no one person has a corner on knowledge in any field. And it's that wonderful quote about, I stand on the shoulders of giants, but we do literally all stand on the work of people who came before us. And so it's really a beautiful idea that honors that what both Ken and Lynn Maxfield were talking about, which is the knowledge born of experience as being just as valuable and just as worthy and really just as true as the scientific knowledge that we put through the scientific method, as Lynn Maxfield explained so well.
Yeah, and I think actually some of those areas, sorry, go ahead, Ken.
It's okay. I see two things here at least. We're all very supportive of the idea of science-informed pedagogy, as you mentioned. And when I go to conferences, interdisciplinary conferences, that's typically the focus and the emphasis at such conferences. So we want to bring many of our colleagues that have perhaps been science shy into realizing that there's great benefit to be had from science-informed pedagogy. At the same time, when I go to these interdisciplinary conferences, it feels like the only evidence that is considered to be serious evidence is evidence from rigorous scientific studies. And you can even see this in our favorite journals. I'm on the editorial board of the Journal of Singing. We used to have a category, there's still a category in our evaluations called pedagogic opinion. Those pieces don't appear much anymore in our journals because people are a little bit shy of presenting something that isn't from some sort of scientific study. And I have raised this issue a number of times in our meetings. How can we invite this back in? I remember some great columns back in the late 80s, early 90s, the point counterpoint column that Richard Miller started when he was the journal editor at that time, for example. And the validity of teacher experience and expertise at the truth discussion table. So I'm very interested in promoting that without denigrating at all the great value that the scientific studies and research in any area brings to the table as well.
Lynn M., what were you saying?
Well, I think that actually ties really nicely to what I was going to say. And when you're forming these opinions, as you get the teacher or pedagogic opinion page, those are formed from experimentation within your own studio oftentimes, right? You are trying new things, and sometimes it's very systematic, sometimes it's not particularly systematic, but over time you're developing, as you pointed out, this large N corpus of data that you've collected. And so as I was looking at how to define research and voice research, I found that area right in the middle got very muddy in terms of what was research, what was the teacher experience, and where do we define what does it have to be one or the other. And I think maybe I came to the conclusion that what was in the middle didn't necessarily have to fit into one or the other. They fit all three. And that was sort of the definition of evidence-based voice pedagogy, was living in an area that you can't separate one from another.
Yeah. I think too, I've written a lot about this idea just from a cultural standpoint of privileging scientific knowledge over humanistic knowledge. And there's a wonderful quote from a writer that I put in my book. He says, once you start wielding scientific truth, you have to remember you're only talking about half of the truth. So we have to remember that what the humanities do is, we said earlier, is this translational or transformative or interpretive, right? It's the humanities that give these facts or this evidence or whatever we call science meaning. And then I think back to Ken Bozeman's point, wouldn't it be nice if we could, instead of having pedagogical opinion, we could have pedagogical translation, right? Or pedagogical application, yeah, or pedagogical interpretation. So that's kind of what I try to do, I think, with the goals, instead of just talking about how great they are, what does that look like in practice? But then to always go back to this has been tested solidly for over 20 years. The efficacy of goal setting is well known if it's applied well. So it's just, if we can just continue, I think, with evidence-based vocal pedagogy, with this idea of those two sides coming together, I think we can really make some wonderful progress.
Ultimately, the goal is demonstrating efficacy, right? Science-based practice and practice-based voice teaching, they have to lead to demonstrating efficacy. I know when I first started at the university, the kids would be like, oh, she's a voice science. I was like, well, no, I'm not a voice scientist. And then it also, at first I thought, oh, she's into voice science. And I thought of it as a badge of honor. But over time, I thought, wait a minute, guys, all of that I try and study and stay up on is only to serve application. Mm-hmm. That to me, that's a part of who we are as voice teachers, but it all has to lead to the application. I don't know what your thoughts are in your teaching with that, I'm sure.
I will chime in again. I learned the word, I'm always learning from my colleagues because they read more than I do, which I love. but I learned the word heurism a few years back, and heurism is about, in a sense, good enough solutions. They're not random and they're not just made up things. They're based on plausible, possible things, but usually they're solutions that haven't been fully vetted by rigorous scientific studies. But that's what we do all day long in the studio. We take whatever informed source we're using, and we have a human being in front of us that's very complex and is holistic, and we can't isolate the variables. We're teaching a human being, so we try things and we find patterns of efficacy in the things that we try, and those contribute then to our gradually developing heuristic pedagogy. So I try to do a science-informed heuristic pedagogy, which kind of puts the two together. They have to be sufficient for the problem at hand and efficient with the time you have. And they're completely unique to the individual in front of you, almost unique. They're very customized, is what I was looking for, customized to the individual.
And aren't they also unique to the situation?
Yes.
Right? I mean, I think that's what annoys our non-science inclined colleagues, and they're right to be annoyed. I've said this forever. There's always in the early days of science in our discipline, at least the latest iteration of it, was this kind of head scratching about why more voice teachers weren't more interested. And so I just said once, well, it may be because they think there's no value in the science. I mean, duh. But what's interesting about that is that now there are some sciences that are really in a crisis because of something called ecological validity, which is just a fancy phrase for it worked great in the lab and it was a great theory, but when you put it to test in the real world, it fell apart. And so if you think about the things that any singer has to put up with when they leave the studio and actually go perform on stage, so we're talking about if it's a recital, we have a piano that may be out of tune, we have a pianist that may be having a migraine, or they lost their glasses and they can't see the score, or they're using an electronic score and they can't turn the page. Then you have, if you're in an opera, you have hairspray, you have a wig, you have props. You have your partner who came out on stage and forgot to bring the prop that you are supposed to sing a 3.5-minute aria to. So these are all things that I think we have to put on the table, back to your heuristic idea. This ecological validity, right? Lynn Maxfield, this is a huge thing in science.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you were to try to control for all of those variables that you've just talked about, well, actually, what we do try to control for them, and by controlling for them, we ignore them, right?
Because why?
Because you can only vary one variable at a time. You can only test one variable at a time in really nice, pure, clean science. And so you have to peel away all of these things that we know are changing. And so, Dr. Tietze and I have talked several times about how we're often optimizing our research for the average voice, and the average voice doesn't exist in nature. Frankly, it's this mathematical average that we're trying to find, that because that's what becomes acceptable in the numbers and it becomes acceptable in the statistics. And so we have to, I think we as scientists, and I'm putting myself in the scientist category because that's what the bulk of my occupation is right now, but not necessarily my training. But we would do ourselves a bit of a favor in talking with the science skeptical if we would recognize what our limitations are and be honest and open. And ecological validity is one of our serious downfalls, or it's one of our Achilles heels. We have many. We have several heels. We're a freak of nature. But I think another thing that we need to remember as we're reading the literature and reading the research and trying to apply it is that science, you can't prove a hypothesis. You can only disprove a hypothesis, right? And so we're constantly adding evidence in support of a hypothesis or against it, but we're never proving it. And so anytime you start talking about findings in absolutes, you have to be very careful about that.
Ken, you look like you want
I sometimes say in that vein, and again, just to reiterate, I'm very indebted to my science colleagues that have provided some amazing information that has helped me become a better teacher. At the same time, on one of the chats on Facebook, you know, in some of these groups that are science interested, someone wrote, "We don't know anything until science tells us it's true." And I just went, oh, no. And so I had a little pushback to that because the very thing that Lynn Maxfield was saying, part of being a good scientist is always having a certain skepticism about where things are and what the conclusions are and qualifying what we can say and what we can't say. So I view scientific studies with the same skepticism that I view pedagogic points of view. You know, it's not a rejections kind of skepticism. It's just a questioning, wondering, and I only know for sure in the application. I try to understand what the points that are being made from either point of view, whether it's historic pedagogy or a scientific study or an idea that I've just come up with. It's in the application and whether or not it works. Did it work? Did it work for several students? How many students did it work for? You know, and in what circumstances did it work? So I think it's fair to that, you know, just bear in mind that we should always be open to the possibility that we don't have it just right, because that's not just a possibility, it's a probability that we don't have it completely right.
Reality.
And drawing from whatever sources we have to continue to improve our efficacy.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I think we could probably keep talking about this all afternoon, the four of us, but thank you again for your contribution. I really, from the bottom of my heart, I am so deeply grateful, and I can't wait to see where else this goes as the conversation continues. And we wish everybody a wonderful NATS 2020 conference. Thanks for joining us.